Okay, hi. So before I start, I wanted to just give a big thank you to everyone here, because I know it's a choice, it's a decision you make to come out to church, to come out to service, to come out to these corporate gatherings. So thank you for making the choice. I want to say a special thank you to the parents of our young children. I know that in this season where the children are with us in service, sometimes it's hard to really focus on what God is trying to say to you or what God is trying to plant in you. But we are trusting and praying that God is giving you a special grace in this season to encounter God in a deep, deep way. And even in the midst of your divided attentions, that you will encounter God's victory. We know that it can be easier sometimes to just stay home with the kids instead of lugging them all out here. So we really appreciate that you are choosing to do so. We also want to acknowledge that we really believe that you choosing to show your kids that worship amongst a corporate body is important. It's a priority. It's actually shaping and changing them. It's helping them to see that God is important to you and to them. And so I really believe that even though it might be a little bit like chaotic and you might feel a little distracted in this season, that you are placing your children in a place where their hearts and their spirits are being transformed. So thank you for taking the time and making the choice to come out here. I want to thank those of you adults who are not parents or who are not parents of young children. Thank you for choosing to engage with this community, even in the midst of the chaos and the noise, even when it's not like the most opportune time to go deep with God or to have like intimate worship with God. But the fact that you're choosing to stay engaged and staying committed to this community, we really appreciate it. And I also believe that God is actually teaching and training you to hear Him and see Him and like acknowledge Him in the midst of chaos and noise, to see Him in everything, to see Him in our children and in the interruptions. So there is fruit in this. I really believe God is training your hearts and your spiritual eyes to see Him all the time. And then to our kids, thank you so much for being such good listeners. Yes, I know that it's not fun all the time to listen to us adults speak and go on and on for like half an hour teaching you about things that maybe sometimes you don't understand. We really, really appreciate how you guys are trying really hard to listen and to be quiet and to not distract other people. And I really, really believe that God is changing your heart. I think He's training you and transforming you into people who love prayer and who are going to pray really powerful and effective prayers. So thank you for being who you are. Thank you for being willing to receive as much as you can out of these services. I know it's not as fun as like Family Day, but we really trust and believe that God's doing something in your hearts even now. So thank you, and you will be rewarded today with some of these fancy treats if you can listen really well, and if you can help the people around you, specifically your parents, to listen well as well. Listen well as well, by being quiet and not distracting them too much, okay? And adults, if you want to be rewarded, you're welcome to come up and grab some treats as well, okay? But that's after the service. So, we're going to start off today with a challenge, or I've adapted this game that sometimes we play in our house or in our car when it gets a little noisy. Some of you parents and children may be familiar with it. We call it the quiet game. And so it's a little bit different, but we're all going to do it. And so for 30 seconds, I'm going to have all of you, and if you're sitting on top of somebody or really close to someone, maybe try and find your own space. If you have something in your hands, maybe place it beside you so your hands are free. And put your hands in your lap, and I'd like you to close your eyes. And we're going to be quiet for 30 seconds. time to open your eyes. Okay, ready? Take a few deep breaths in. And let's start being quiet now. Wow, that was amazing. You guys did really good. Give yourselves a clap. Pat yourself on the back. For those of you who are super tired, good job for waking up right now. So how was that for you guys? Was that like super fun and super exciting? Really stimulating? Yeah. Or was that, and be honest, was that hard? Was that boring? Thank you. It was boring, wasn't it? Yes. Being quiet and being still is kind of boring. But guess what? I'm going to have you guys do that a few more times during this session. And actually, what you're going to do is I'm setting this bell to ring. You can hear it. See that bell? So it's going to go off every 5 or 6 minutes or so in the middle of my teaching. And every time you hear that bell, we're going to stop everything. I'm going to stop talking. You're going to stop doing whatever you're doing. We're going to put our hands in our laps, with our palms up as if we're receiving something. We're going to close our eyes, take a few deep breaths, and we're going to just be quiet for 30 seconds. Okay? So be listening for the bell. We'll see what happens. So you're probably wondering, oops, just a second. Please reduce, oh, I see. Okay. Let me just fix this. What time is it right now?
3:54.
Okay. Okay, so I'm starting it. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why are we doing this? And I'm not trying to keep you guys all quiet, and this is just not a way for me to torture you. We're doing this because for the next 2 weeks, all of us together as a corporate body are actually going to practice contemplative prayer. And in contemplative prayer, it's really important to practice being quiet before God. Not sleeping before God, being quiet before God. So up to this point, we've learned about prayers that are about talking and speaking and asking God for things, or like thanking Him or complaining to Him, or we're trying to listen to what He's saying, trying to listen for His voice. Contemplative prayer is not so much about what you're saying or what you're doing as it is about being, and specifically being with God. So the Apostle Paul writes about contemplation in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18, and he writes this: "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit." So the Greek word that is used for the word contemplate also means to behold. And it means actually to behold as if in a mirror. So how many of you were teenagers who like to look at yourself in the mirror before you got ready? Anyone? Yeah? Like I remember spending at least half an hour every time I would go out. Maybe not as a teenager, but as a young adult, for sure. And like I would just behold myself, right? I would gaze at myself, look at what needed to be fixed, and make sure. Sometimes I actually would talk to myself in the mirror, but I would behold myself. And that's actually kind of what this idea of contemplation is. Or have you guys ever seen a baby with a mirror? They just like to look, right? look at themselves in the mirror, and like they play with themselves, and it's fun because someone is staring right back at them. And that is what beholding means. That's what contemplating means. It means looking and focusing and gazing at God and seeing his eyes looking back right at you. So this is kind of what contemplative prayer is. Because now as an adult, as a mom, like I barely look at myself in the mirror. I only look at myself really every Sunday morning to prepare for service. Like all the other times I barely look at myself because I'm in a rush. I just, like I've got things to do. But contemplation is a time where we slow down, where we kind of stop, take a rest, and we look and we behold God's gaze. We look at him and we see him looking back at us. That is what contemplation is. Some people call this type of prayer meditation. And this is not like the meditation that somehow Oliver learned how to do, and I feel like as a pastor's kid you really shouldn't know that. But that's not the type of meditation we're talking about. It's not a type of meditation where you're emptying your minds and like making them blank. What you're doing is you're actually opening up your mind so that you can focus on the things of God, so that you can think about the things that God thinks about, and you can see the things that God is seeing. Now, honestly, in our day and age, this is actually really difficult for us. This is probably one of the most difficult types of prayer that God asks us to do, because we are constantly rushing, we're constantly hurrying. There's always constant noise in the background, there's always something that we need to do, something that we need to see, something that we need to experience, something that we need to produce or accomplish or be successful at. Or we just have a hard time being still because we want to be entertained all the time. And if we are being still and being quiet, usually it's because it's something really good on Netflix, right? Very rarely do we choose to be quiet, to sit and be still before God. Very rarely. In fact, we are people that so hate being bored that we would choose to experience pain over boredom. And let me elaborate on this. There was a study done in 2014 where they had a bunch of college students come into a room that was completely undecorated. It was a plain white room with nothing on the walls, no clock. They had no phones, no books, nothing to write with, nothing to fiddle around with. They had to sit in a chair, keep their butt in the chair, and they couldn't fall asleep. And they had to sit there for 15 minutes with nothing to entertain them. And the only thing that they could choose to do was either think about stuff that they wanted to think about, or they could press a button. And this button would administer a shock through their ankle. And do you know how many people chose, instead of sitting quietly and being still and just thinking their thoughts, do you know how the percentage of people that actually chose to shock themselves with pain? Does anyone want to guess?
100%.
No, not 100%. But let me tell you, men, you are far worse than women. Men scored, 67% of men in this study chose to buzz themselves, shock themselves. Not just once, but twice. And there was actually one man who decided to shock himself 190 times.
Wow.
So there's obviously something else going on with him. Women chose to shock themselves. Out of the women, there are 25% of those women who chose to press the button and shock themselves. Because we as a society, as a people, we hate being bored. We hate sitting still and being quiet with our thoughts. So, of course, contemplative prayer is going to be hard. It's just in our culture, in our makeup maybe even, that we have a hard time sitting still and being quiet. But it is really important in growing our relationship with God. And here's why. Because many of us have at least one person in our lives that we can be really comfortable with, that we don't have to say anything with, and we can just be with, right? At least one person. Where, like, it's okay to have the silences because they're not that awkward. But most of those relationships that we have with that one or two people in our lives, those relationships have been formed over long periods of time. And they have levels of like very deep, deep intimacy. Like, you know, when I was dating Brian, we talked all the time. Now we barely talk. I'm just joking. But we did. We talked all the time. We were long distance and we were on the phone 3 to 4 hours, like almost every night, talking. We didn't run out of things to say. And I guess maybe also because I was a little bit insecure, like we barely had any awkward silences because I just couldn't handle them. But the more you grow in intimacy, the more deeply known you feel and the safer you feel, the more common it is to sit in silence with each other and be okay. I love like looking at old people and just being like, oh, they're so cute. And like they don't have to be talking, they don't have to be doing anything. They're just sitting together, watching the world. And it's just like, they're just so comfortable with one another. I read an article about a woman who's caring for her dying husband, and she said this: you know you're in love when you can be in a room with someone and not have to talk, when just being in their presence is enough. When I was around him, it felt like home. And that is just a smidgen of the level of intimacy that God longs for us to have with him, where we're so in love with him, we're so aware of his presence that we don't need to do or say anything. All we want to do is just rest in him, because we know that in him we are home. Contemplative prayer, being quiet and still before God, helps us to practice that kind of presence with God. And I know this is hard for us. For some of us, it might be easier to just talk to God, to just ask him for things. For some of us, it might be easier to just complain or to, give thanksgiving. Some of us, it might be easier to just, read pre-written prayers and recite those. But eventually, we all need to get to a place where we are so in love with God, where we're so comfortable being in his presence, that we don't have to do anything or say anything to know that he is with us and to be aware of his presence with us. So it's not like the climax of prayer in terms of like the different stages of prayer. You can be a contemplative without going through all the different other types of prayer, but if you're just starting out in prayer, sometimes those prayers where you're reciting the prayers or you're just asking God for things or just having a conversation with God, those things might be a good stepping stone into a place where you can just be quiet and still before him. So, because it's hard, and Christians from ancient times know that it's hard, they have developed some tools for us to use in contemplative prayer so that it's not so hard. And, I know, I don't know what you guys were thinking in the 30 seconds that we were sitting still. Maybe you're thinking, why are we doing this? Maybe you're thinking about what to make for dinner tonight. Maybe you're thinking about who would win, a Tyrannosaurus Rex or a Spinosaurus. I don't know what you're thinking about. But it's very easy for our mind to wander when we are sitting still and quiet and trying to focus on God. So one thing, oops, my bell went off. So let's just do this, but I'm trying to...
I didn't hear anything.
I know!
It's working.
No, it's not working. Why is it not working? Okay, I'm just gonna play it. Let's be still before God for 30 seconds. So take a few deep breaths in. think about God. Okay, good job. Okay, so, sorry, now it's gonna work, but now you're gonna hear all of my notifications as well. Sorry, I don't know how to figure this out, so we're just gonna have to listen to my notifications, but then you'll hear the bell go off. Okay, so, what was I saying? Okay, so a tool to help you as you practice contemplative prayer is something called the breath prayer. And this is a very easy exercise. So when you are practicing being quiet before God and you see or you feel like your mind is starting to think about things that are not of God, you can actually do a breath in and say a little prayer like, Jesus, you love me. And then you take a breath out, you breathe the breath out, and you can say, Jesus, I love you. Or you can say something like, breath in, God, you're here. Breath out, God, I'm here. Or you can use a passage from a verse from the Bible, like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Okay? And this you keep doing until your mind comes back into focusing on Jesus. So let's practice this. We're going to do the breathing in, Jesus, you love me. Breathing out, I love you, Jesus. Okay? And we can, all the kids, you guys can do this too, okay? So take a deep breath in. Jesus, I love you. Just say it in your head.
You love me, you mean?
Or sorry, Jesus, you love me. And breathe out. Jesus, I love you. Do that one more time. Take a deep breath in. Jesus, you love me. Take a deep breath out. Jesus, I love you. Okay. So the next time the bell rings, which is going to be in 3 minutes, you can practice that. Now, for some of you who are maybe a little bit more visual or kinesthetic, this is another tool that you could use. So I'm not naturally a physically affectionate sort of person, but I love hugging my kids, especially when they're little and they're squishy. Like, I love hugging my big kids, but it's not as like, you know, they can't put their legs around me, I can't hold them, and so it's not as like yummy. But with Oliver, because he's still little and yummy and squishy, when I hug him, it's like, like I feel the love coming between our hearts, and it's just like, So a lot of times, like just randomly in the middle of the day, I'll be like, Oliver, and then he'll come up to me, because he'll stop what he's doing. So whatever he's doing, he'll stop. And I'll be like, Oliver, come here. Oliver, come here. Oliver, come here. And he'll actually stop what he's doing, and he'll be like, I know what you want. And I'll be like, what do I want? He's like, you want cuddles. And I'm like, yeah, I do want cuddles. And so we'll just hug each other. And I always say it's like heart to heart. And I tell him it actually helps me to relax. But I also know that it's good for him. And it's good for my big kids too. And I will hug my big kids too. Like, don't look at them looking like, come on, Mom. But I do. Like, I will say, Zoe, give me a hug. Or actually, Zoe always asks me for a hug. But Jaden especially, I'll be like, Jaden, give me a hug. Anyway, so it's important for us to show that kind of affection to our children. And almost interrupt their routine or whatever they're doing to show that affection. Because they need to know, number one, that they're loved, that they're important to me, but also that whatever they're doing is not as important as our relationship. And I feel like God does that too. Like he wants to interrupt us when we're busy doing things or, focusing on other stuff. I feel like he's like, Oliver or Tyson, Jimmy, and he's like, stop, come here, give me a hug. Oh. So in this instance, take a deep breath and say a breath prayer. So, Jesus, you love me. Take a deep breath out and say, Jesus, I love you. And we're going to do that for 30 seconds. Okay, good job. So, I feel like God likes to interrupt us too. And he wants to give us a prayer. So for me, sometimes contemplative prayer is actually not always about doing the breath prayer. It's not always like, reading the Bible and kind of focusing on the passage. Sometimes, as I'm practicing silent contemplative prayer, I like to imagine that I'm being hugged by God. Or that he's holding my hand. Or that he's holding my face in his hands and he's just gazing at me lovingly. And for me, sometimes those things are more powerful than just the words, maybe because I'm more of a visual person, or maybe it's just, God speaks to us in different ways. So the next time the bell rings, I want you to try and practice that. Imagine God embracing you in a hug. Or if that doesn't feel comfortable, imagine God holding your hand or putting his arm around your shoulder and sitting with you. Okay? So, we've briefly gone through what contemplative prayer is, and I've just touched like the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more in terms of contemplative prayer, but because of time, we're just going to cut it short. And you are going to learn more about it next Sunday in your family home groups in the videos. But I want to talk about when we should practice being with God through prayer. And let's read what Paul has to say in his first letter to the Thessalonian church in chapter 5, verses 16 to 18. And it says, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. So, this sounds like a pretty impossible thing that Paul is telling us to do, right? Like, pray continually, which means pray without stopping. It means always be praying. But if we define prayer as being with God, and we know that God is always with us, then maybe it's not as impossible as we think it is. We just need to take these baby steps and practice being with him. And in some ways, monks and nuns have it easier, right? They're cloistered away, secluded. They get to worship God not whenever they want to, but they get to worship God at certain times. They have very little distractions to keep them from being with God on a continual basis. But obviously, I'm not a nun, even though sometimes I wish I was, especially after watching Sound of Music. But I'm not, obviously. And I know you guys, I'm assuming, are not nuns or monks living in monasteries or nunneries. We live regular lives filled with distractions and work and really mundane things in our life. We have to do the laundry, we have to wash the dishes, we have to feed ourselves or feed our children. For kids, there's things like homework and playing with your friends and cleaning up after yourself, or maybe even doing chores, or sometimes trying to share things with your siblings. So how do we practice being with God? How do we practice praying without stopping in the middle of our regular non-monk, non-nun lives? But the fact is that monks and nuns actually still, they still had to do mundane tasks. They still had to do laundry, they still had to wash dishes, they still had to cook for themselves, they still had to sweep the floors. Oh my God, really? Really? I don't know who's calling me, but shame on you. No, I don't know who's calling. Okay. So monks had to do these mundane things in life, but they were also practicing the presence of God in these mundane things. And if you guys, some of you guys know about the book, The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence, and he talks about how we need to acquire a habit of becoming aware of God in everything that we do, in every situation that we're in, and that everything we do actually, we do it for the love of God. So for Brother Lawrence, it was like if he had to pick up a piece of straw off the floor, it was like, God is in this, and I'm doing this for the love of God. Maybe for a new mom or dad, it's like changing a diaper, and as you're changing this poopy, dirty diaper, you're like, I invite you, God, into this as I clean up crap, and I love you. Thank you for giving me the privilege of being a mom or dad. Or maybe it's like things like washing the dishes or making your beds, where it's like, God, you are the creator of the universe. Lord, you are one who brings order into chaos. Thank you that I get to partner with you in this. So praying continually means recognizing that God is always present. He's with you all the time. And that if we invite him into whatever we're doing, God will be in everything that we do. That is what it means to pray continually. So this is easy enough to say, but it's actually harder to actually implement. Because we just get so busy during the day. We have so many distractions, right? So I wanted to share a couple of things. Oh, see, this is what happened when we forgot our mindfulness bell. Okay. Let's be quiet. So let's close our eyes, take a few deep breaths in, and this time I want you to imagine God embracing you, holding your hand, giving you a hug, putting his arm around your shoulder, and we'll do that for 30 seconds. Okay, good job. So, I want to share a couple of things that I have been trying to practice so that I can become more comfortable in contemplative prayer. And the first thing I have been trying to do, and I think I've probably been doing this for almost a year now, is practice silent prayer. And I am nowhere close to mastering this. Like, there are still mornings where the first thing I do in the morning is look at my emails or scroll through Facebook. But what I would like to do and what I try and do is I actually try and stay away from the distractions that my phone is offering. And there is an app that I use on my phone called Centering Prayer. And it's something that I use that actually times like my silent times with him. And it starts, there's like a gong that starts my time and then a gong that ends my time. But it means that I don't have to focus on the clock. And it just means that I can just be quiet and still before him. And when I started like with 5-minute intervals. And that, even 5 minutes is really hard for me. Like my mind would wander, I would start to get really anxious about all the things that I needed to get done. But now I'm in a place where like I can do 20 minutes, and I actually feel like 20 minutes, like I just feel like I'm just getting into it. So practice does I highly recommend for those of you, especially who if the first thing you do is wake up in the morning and you look at your phone and you check your social media or whatever, I really highly recommend that you try and start your morning off with silent prayer. And if you can't do silent prayer, even if it's just like, good morning, God, what would you have me do for you today? Just something where it's acknowledging that the day is God's. Okay? The second thing, I just started a couple weeks ago. And it was actually kind of like a fluke that it happened, but it's actually really helped me become more aware of God's presence throughout the day. So I've been having shoulder pain, and my physiotherapist actually told me, if you don't fix your posture, then any of the exercises that I'm teaching you how to do, it'll be in vain, because you need to first fix your posture. So I went on YouTube and I found a physiotherapist on YouTube who was saying you should set your phone on a timer so that it reminds you to change it or correct your posture. So I found this app called the Mindfulness Bell app. And I don't think it's a Christian app. I think it's some kind of like maybe new age app. But it still works, okay? So I scheduled it to ring every hour. So that's the bell that you heard, actually. I schedule it to ring every hour. And what I do is I check my posture. But it's now morphed into this thing where it's not just about checking my physical posture, but I'm also being reminded to check my spiritual posture. And what I'm doing is every time the bell rings, like I'm correcting my posture, but I'm also taking a few deep breaths in, and I'm focusing on God. I'm either doing a breath prayer, or I'm imagining Him giving me a big hug, or I look at my phone Bible app and I just meditate on a verse. But it's actually really helped me to be mindful of God throughout the day, every hour actually. And I've been doing this for only a couple of weeks now. And the amazing thing is, now that I've done it so often and so frequently, is that even without the bell, I find myself, let's be quiet and still before God. So let's close our eyes, take a few deep breaths in and out, and you can do a breath prayer, you can imagine God holding you, or you can even just say your own prayer to God in your head. But let's be quiet before Him. Okay. Now 30 seconds feels too short, doesn't it? Now you're like, oh, I want to do like a minute or 2 minutes. Okay, so these apps are really great for helping you to practice the presence of God. And honestly, if you get into a habit of it, it actually starts to be where you don't even need the bell anymore. You just are reminded, oh, I'm going to fix my posture, and I'm going to fix my heart posture. And focus on God. Okay, so that's the power of habit. And as you guys know, we've really been emphasizing habits, right? Growing our spiritual disciplines this year. Why? Because we want to be true disciples of Jesus, who follow Jesus. And to be followers of Jesus, what do we need to do? We need to do the things that He did. But why do we do all these things? Why do we practice the disciplines like Sabbath rest, like hospitality, like prayer, so that they can become integrated into the regular rhythms of our lives, and so that we can be like Jesus. And this is not just so that we can be people who are like good people, or so that we can be like, look at all the good habits that we have formed and boast about them. We're doing this because we are expecting and praying for and trusting that as we do these habits, God is transforming our hearts. And that we are actually becoming more and more like Jesus. Our habits form us. And the things that we focus on form our habits. So if we focus on our gaze on things that are not of God, we will form habits around these things. And all those things will not form us, they'll actually deform us into becoming less and less human, less like Jesus. If we focus our gaze on God, we will form habits around gazing on God. And these habits will transform us and help us to become more like Jesus. So let's look at that verse from 2 Corinthians chapter 3 again. And we all who, with unveiled faces, contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. This is why we do what we do, why we practice praying and being with God continually, without ceasing, because we want to be transformed into the image of God. Not for our sakes, so that we can be good people who live good lives, but for the mission of Jesus, which is to restore the world back to him. As we spend time with God in prayer and silence and stillness, as we contemplate God, as we behold him, God will transform our hearts to become more like his, so that through us, Jesus can continue to do his ministry. We can heal the sick and the wounded. We can bring salvation and freedom to those who are oppressed. We can bring justice into those places where there is injustice. We can restore relationships. We can spread love and peace and hope and bring heaven to earth. This is why we do all that we do. This is why we're practicing these disciplines. Not just for the fun of it, but so that we can bring heaven to earth like Jesus did. So let's get on board, right? Like, let's become people who love Jesus so much, who are so in love with him, that we just want to spend time with him all the time. That the things of this world are actually, will be dimmer and will be paler compared to the glory of who he is and spending time with him. So I'm going to get us to pray one more time in silence. We're going to make it a little bit longer. And I just want you to, again, focus your eyes, your spiritual eyes on Jesus. If you need to, think about being hugged by him. If you need to, do some breath prayers. But we're going to do this, and we're going to do it for double the time. We're going to do it for 1 minute. And then that's how we're going to end the service. Okay? Are we ready? Okay, I'm not going to do the bell again. In fact, I'm going to turn my silent mode on. Okay. I'm going to be the bell. So take some deep breaths in. Close your eyes. Place your hands on your laps as if you're receiving something from God. Ding. Amazing. Kids, you guys rock. I'm so impressed by all of you kids who are able to be so still and so quiet. Same thing with the adults. Good job. Let me just pray for you, and then that's the end of service. God, we just thank you so much for your desire to have us draw near to you. We thank you, Lord, that you are always here, that you are in the air. Thank you, God, that when we have our eyes open to you, when we have our ears and our hearts open to you, Lord, that you want to show us your beauty, your goodness, your mysteries. And I just pray that we as a people would just grow in our hunger for you and for your presence. We pray that you would instill in us a desire to just be so in love with you, that we just want to spend every waking moment with you. And Lord, I know that sometimes that sounds unrealistic, but I pray that you would help us to do that. Lord, that in our daily, crazy, hectic lives, that you would remind us to slow down, to stop, and to set our gaze on you, to see you in every circumstance, in every situation, to see you in the work of our hands, and to see you even in the places that don't seem like you are there, like even when we're in the midst of a fight with our spouse or a sibling, even when we're in the midst of things that are not happening the way that we expected them to happen. Lord, I pray that you would help us to train us so that we can see you even in those times, Lord, that we can hear your voice and that we can be obedient to you. Help us to be people who become like you through prayer. Help us to be people who bring your kingdom to this world that so needs you. Thank you for giving us that great privilege and that great responsibility, and for trusting us to hold that carefully. So Lord, I just pray for all of us this week, continue to remind us constantly, continually, that you're here with us. In the name of Jesus we pray.